The signal lasted 4 seconds. That was enough. Sergeant Maravas had been awake for 31 hours when it came through, sitting in the dust of listening post-Kestrel, with a cold cup of coffee balanced on her knee and her headset chewing static. The post was a joke. 3 shipping containers welded together on a ridge in the eastern Cordal era, solar panels on the roof, a single dish antenna the size of a swimming pool pointed at the sky. Her assignment was to monitor the orbital band for anomalous transmissions. A job so boring it had killed 2 postings before hers. A job that existed because 18 months ago, something had crossed the heliopause and started broadcasting on a frequency human engineers described, with stunning unhelpfulness, as not ours. Seconds, a pulse, a pause, 4 seconds, another pulse, offset by a half-step in pitch, was. And she understood this only because she'd studied the original signal files until they blurred into her dreams. A response. Someone up there had heard them trying, and they were talking back. She didn't scream. She didn't run. She picked up her coffee, discovered it was cold, and put it back down. Then she carefully removed her headset, set it on the console, and walked to the door of the container, and stood there looking at the mountains, breathing the thin air, because if she didn't do something ordinary in the next 30 seconds, she was going to fly apart like a grenade. The mountains were very still, pink in the early light. A condor rode a thermal above the far ridge, wings locked, not working at all, just letting the world hold it up. Okay, Mara said, to nobody. She went back inside and began the verification protocol. Her name technically was Dr. Sergeant Mara Voss, because the UN Listening Initiative had a peculiar organizational structure in which civilian researchers were assigned military ranks to satisfy the member nations who were funding it, and Mara had a doctorate in xenolinguistics that she'd earned at 26 and spent the next 4 years being told was useless. Her dissertation had been on the pattern structure of dolphin communication and whether syntactic recursion was a product of intelligence or merely a product of social complexity. Her advisor had called it speculative. 3 reviewers had called it premature. One had simply written "why" in the margin and left it there, which she thought was actually the most honest thing anyone had written to her in graduate school. She was 31 now. She had not spoken to another human being in 11 days, which was fine. The post had comms. She used them to file reports and order supplies. She had a satellite link she used to play chess games by correspondence with a retired signals officer in Edinburgh named Graham, was 93 years old, sharp as a needle, and the only person she'd found who understood that silence was not the same as loneliness. She was, by most measurements, good at being alone. She was also, and she understood this the moment the second pulse arrived, the only person in the right place, at the right time, with the right ears to hear what was happening. The verification took 40 minutes. She ran it twice. Then she opened the priority channel to Geneva and said, in the flattest voice she could manage, that she needed to speak to the initiative's chief signals officer immediately. It was not a drill, and yes, she had verified, and yes, she was sure, and no, she said. She was not going to summarize it in a message flag, because summaries were reductive, and what she needed was for someone with authority to get on this line and listen. Dr. Yusuf Eret got on the line 11 minutes later. He sounded like he'd been asleep. He had. It was 3 a.m. in Geneva. Tell me what you have, he said. She told him. There was a silence. Not the empty kind, the full kind. The kind that comes when a person is reassessing every assumption they've made in the last decade. It's keyed to our broadcast, he said finally. Yes. They decoded it. They decoded it. Or something in their signal system pattern matched to ours. Could be instinctive. Could be deliberate. Either way, they know we were transmitting at them, and they sent something back that uses our structure as a scaffold. She paused. Yusuf. It's a conversation opener. That's what this is. Another silence. What do you need? He asked. Access to the primary dish. Full bandwidth. No restrictions. The translation team in Geneva, all of them right now. And someone needs to tell the Security Council in the next 6 hours. Because this is going to get complicated very quickly. And I would prefer to have done the paperwork before the complicated part starts. Done, he paused. Mara, do you understand what this is? Yes, she said. Good. Frightened. She thought about that. The condor, the mountains, the cold coffee. Not yet, she said. Ask me again in a week. The week was actually 3 days. Within 72 hours of Mara's report, the listening post Kestrel had become something else entirely. The UN Security Council had convened an emergency session. 6 military satellites had been repositioned. A team of 23 scientists, linguists, physicists, and one extremely confused marine biologist, who had been included by accident and was too professional to say so, arrived via helicopter in staggered groups. The ridge that had been silent for a year was now lit like a small city. Mara had moved her cot into the corner of the main console room and refused to leave. She ate her meals there. She slept in 3-hour intervals with her headset on her chest. The new arrivals treated her with the careful deference of people who needed something from her but weren't sure what. What they needed, it turned out, was patience. The signal was not a language, not yet. It was a structure, a framework. The alien transmission team, and the word alien kept snagging in everyone's throats, requiring a small private swallow before it could be said aloud, had taken humanity's original broadcast, which had been a mathematical primer of sorts, a sequence of primes and geometric relationships arranged in layered harmonic patterns, and had responded with something that echoed its structure while extending it in ways that were clearly deliberate and equally clearly not random. It was like, Mara explained to the assembled scientists on the second day, when you played a chord at someone who knew music and they played one back. They weren't repeating you. They weren't translating. They were responding within the vocabulary you'd established, using it to show you that they knew you were speaking, and that they could speak back, and that they were interested in doing so. How intelligent are they? One of the military observers asked. Mara looked at him for a moment. Intelligent enough to not assume we are, she said. They're being very careful. They haven't asserted anything. They're just showing us they're listening. Cautious, someone said. Polite, she said. She went back to her console. The thing she didn't tell the assembled scientists, the thing she barely admitted to herself in the odd, quiet hours, when the post was relatively still, and she could hear the wind against the containers, was that the signal had texture. This was not a technical term. It was not something she could put in a report. She had spent 4 years listening to dolphins, and her doctoral research had taught her that communication had layers below meaning. The carrier, wave of intent, the tonality of context, the soft modulations that said not just what but how. The alien signal had those. They were faint. They were possibly imaginary. But they were there in the same way a person's voice has character beyond its words. A quality that makes you recognize someone before you consciously register who they are. The signal felt, to Mara, like someone sitting very quietly in a room, afraid to move too fast, watching to see if you'd run. It felt, in other words, like shyness. She kept this to herself for 6 days. Then, on the 7th day, something changed. The signal shifted, not in structure, in rhythm. The pulses became slightly shorter. The pauses between them, which had been perfectly even, developed an irregularity. Not a malfunction, not a technical artifact. She ran the noise floor analysis herself 3 times. But something organic, variable, as if the timing were being produced not by a machine on automatic, but by something that was deciding, each time, when to pulse. She sat with her headphones on in the dark at 2 in the morning. Everyone else asleep, or working in Geneva, on the translation matrices. And she listened, and she understood what she was hearing. It was hesitation. Whatever was on the other end of that signal was hesitating, pausing, considering, perhaps afraid that it had said too much, or not enough, or said it wrong. Mara pulled up the transmission interface, the one she was not supposed to use without a committee, decision, and a 3-day review process, and sign-off from no fewer than 4 different UN bodies. She stared at it for a long time. Then she opened it. She didn't use the mathematical framework. That wasn't what this moment needed. She composed a signal that was, she would have to explain this very carefully to a very angry doctor. Structurally identical to the alien hesitation pattern, the pause-pulse-pause rhythm they'd shifted to. She took it. She mirrored it. She sent it back, the lump with the intervals slightly extended, as you would slow your own breathing when sitting with someone who was frightened, to show them that you were also slowing down, that you had time, that there was no emergency, that you were not going anywhere. She sent it and sat back and waited. The response came in 47 seconds. It was, to her enormous relief, not threatening. It was not clarifying. It was not a mathematical proof or an information dump or a territorial assertion. It was the same rhythm, her hesitation mirror, sent back to her, but with a tiny modification. The final pulse was slightly longer. Not a mistake. It was too precise to be a mistake. It was an addition, a contribution to the pattern. They were playing, she realized. Call and response. Two people humming the same tune, and then one of them adds a note. She added a note back. This was how the first real conversation between humanity and the Vorath began. Not with a declaration, not with a prepared statement, not with the 16-page diplomatic greeting that the UN committee had been drafting for 11 months. It began with two entities in the dark, both of them a little frightened, both of them reaching, both of them uncertain, playing a game of musical tag across the void. Mara didn't sleep for the next 30 hours. She stayed at the console, and she played, building the exchange, extending and varying and listening to how they extended and varied back, feeling the contours of a sensibility that was. She could not prove this. She would never be able to prove this. But she knew it with the bone-deep certainty of a researcher who has spent a career listening to minds not, like her own, deeply, genuinely curious. They wanted to know her, or rather, they wanted to know if she could be known, if she was the kind of thing that could be understood. They were feeling for the edges of her. The way you feel in the dark for the shape of a room, hands out, tentative, ready to stop if something unexpected came back. She let them feel. She made herself available to it. She thought about her graduate supervisor, writing "why" in the margin, and decided that for the first time in her professional life, she had a complete answer. Because this moment, exactly this was why. When Dr. Errett arrived by helicopter at 7 in the morning and found her at the console with dark circles under her eyes and a look he later described as serenely deranged, she had already mapped 43 distinct units of alien communication and established a provisional grammar for 26 of them. He did not, to his credit, lead with the unauthorized transmission. He looked at her screens for a long time, and then he sat down, and then he said, "Show me." The committee meetings were not Mara's strong suit. She understood their necessity. She even agreed with most of their cautions. Communication with an unknown intelligence at interstellar distances was exactly the kind of thing that required oversight, precisely because the stakes were high enough that individual brilliance was an insufficient safety net. She had read her history. She knew what happened when one person, certain of their own rightness, made unilateral decisions on behalf of everyone. She knew. She agreed. She still found the meetings almost physically painful. The problem was not the caution. The problem was the abstraction. 43 scientists in a room, looking at signal graphs and translation matrices, speaking about the Vorath, as if they were a theorem to be solved rather than a presence to be understood. The military observers wanted to know about threat assessment. The political liaisons wanted to know about disclosure timelines. The physicists wanted to know about the technology that could produce this kind of signal from what they'd estimated as the likely source distance. Nobody was asking the question that Mara thought mattered most. She raised her hand during the third meeting. Dr. Errett, who was chairing, recognized her with the slight wariness of a man who had learned to brace himself. "What are they afraid of?" she said. Silence. "We've been analyzing the signal for their information content," she said. "Their technology, their mathematics, their star position, their communication protocols. All of that is useful. None of it is the thing." She stood up, which she hadn't planned to do, and walked to the display screen. "Look at the hesitation intervals. Look at how they've structured every single exchange. They offer, then they wait. They don't push. They've never sent more than we've sent. They match our output volume almost exactly, every single time. They are taking care not to overwhelm us." She turned around. "Whatever these beings are, they are very, very careful not to frighten us. Means they'll understand that we could be frightened. Which means they've thought about it." She paused. "Something out there is trying not to scare us, and I want to know why." The room was very quiet for a moment. Then the military observer, a general named Osi, who had said almost nothing for 3 days, spoke. "Because they've frightened someone before," he said. "Possibly," Mara said. Because they've been frightened. Or both. O.C. looked at her for a long moment. He had a face that gave very little away. Something shifted in it. "What do you recommend?" he said. She sat back down. "We keep playing music," she said. The translation breakthrough came on day 18. It wasn't Mara who cracked it. She would have been the first to say. It was a computational linguist from Nairobi named Dr. Mara Sithole, who had been working on the recurrent grammar for 2 weeks straight, and who walked into the main room at midnight with a face that Mara recognized immediately, having worn it herself, as the face of someone who has just understood something. They weren't certain they could explain. "They don't have nouns," Sithole said. Everyone in the room turned. "Not as a stable category," she said. "Everything in their grammar is relational. Nothing exists in isolation. The word they use, the signal cluster they use, for what we'd call I is not a noun, it's a preposition. It means something like the thing that is presently adjacent to." She paused. "As in, I am the thing that is presently adjacent to you. The self only exists in relation to the other. The moment the other disappears, the word for I disappears with it." Mara sat with this for a moment. "They can't concept of being alone," she said slowly. "Not in the way we can." Sithole's voice was careful. "For them, isolation would be, I'm not sure terrifying is adequate. It might be more like non-existence. They might not have a word for it, because they've never needed one." Mara thought about her 11 days of silence before the signal arrived. She thought about Graham's chess games. She thought about the condor holding itself up on nothing but warm air. "How long have we been broadcasting?" she said. "The original signal, 14 years. So they've been listening to one entity, transmitting into what must look to them like an absolute void, with no response for 14 years. She paused. "And they answered anyway." Sithole looked at her. "Yes, that's not nothing," Mara said. "No," said Sithole. "It really isn't. There were 47 days of exchange before the Vorath sent an image. It was not an image in any format human sensors were designed to receive. It was an image encoded in the signal structure itself. A two-dimensional pattern that, when rendered visually using the mathematical framework the two teams had jointly developed by that point, showed something that the assembled scientists spent 6 hours arguing about before Mara, who had been quiet for all 6 of those hours, said simply, "It's a map." It was a map. Specifically, it was a schematic of relative positions, a stellar cartography not of the Vorath's home system, but of the space between it and Earth, with something that appeared to be a marked trajectory. The military observers became very still. "Before anyone says anything," Mara said, "look at the approach vector." The trajectory on the map was not direct. It looped wide. It came in from the edge. It passed through several clear decision points, marked with a signal cluster they'd come to understand meant something, if, when, only with agreement. The Vorath ship, if that was what this was not traveling toward Earth. It was parked at a distance, in the outer system, waiting. The map was not a statement, it was a question. Mara recognized the hesitation rhythm in its structure. She'd heard it 47 days ago, in the dark, at 2 in the morning, when she'd mirrored it back and understood for the first time that something out there was afraid of being too much. "They're asking permission," she said. "They've been out there this whole time, waiting, and they're asking permission to come closer." General Osi said, very quietly, "How long have they been out there?" She looked at the stellar positions, ran the geometry against the signal delay. Her throat closed for a moment. "At least 4 years," she said. "They've been waiting out there for at least 4 years." The room was silent for a long time. "They came here," Sithole said finally, "and then they waited for us to be ready." The vote in the UN Security Council was 15-2 in favor of the response. Signal. Mara drafted it herself with Sithole. It took 4 days and 7 complete rewrites. Every word, every signal cluster, had to carry the right weight. They were not just answering a question. They were establishing a precedent. The first explicit invitation one species had ever extended to another, across the dark, in full knowledge of what they were doing. The final version was short. By the standards of interstellar diplomacy, almost brief. It confirmed the map's trajectory. It confirmed the decision points. It returned the if-when, only with agreement cluster, amplified, a formality they'd developed that meant, yes, this too, we understand this is conditional. We accept conditions. We agree to agree together. And then it added something Mara had fought for across 3 of the 7 rewrites, the hesitation rhythm, not as content, as frame, getting the whole message. A reminder, she'd argued, that they remembered. That they'd been there, in the dark, 2 entities not sure of each other, feeling for the edges of the room, and neither of them had run, Dr. Errett had looked at the final draft for a long time. This is very personal, he'd said. Yes, Mara said, for a diplomatic document, yes. He thought about it. It's the right call, he said, and signed off on it. The Vorath ship came in slowly. Slower than it needed to, she suspected. Slower than its propulsion should have required. It was again, that careful quality, the matching of pace to what the other person could handle, the instinct to not overwhelm. It passed each of the decision points and at each one broadcast the if, when only with agreement cluster. Pausing, waiting for acknowledgement before continuing, Mara sat at the console for every one of those acknowledgements. No committee vote required, because the procedure had been agreed in advance and she was the designated responder. But she sat there anyway, because she wanted to, because she felt it was important that whoever, or whatever, was on that ship and watching for the light of the reply, should receive it from the same hands that had first heard them hesitating in the dark. She answered each pause. She said yes. She said, we are here. She said, come. The ship reached orbital distance on a Tuesday afternoon. The mountains were very clear that day, the air washed clean by a night of rain. And Mara stepped outside between 2 of the acknowledgement sequences and stood on the ridge and looked at the sky, which looked exactly as it always did, enormous and blue and completely ordinary, with no visible sign that anything was different. Something was up there, looking down at this ridge, she thought. Looking down at these mountains and this air and this single woman, standing in the wind outside a collection of welded shipping containers. Seeing for the first time, the actual ground-level texture of the thing they'd been talking to for 47 days. She wondered what it looked like to them. Whether they'd expected the mountains, or the color of the sky, or the condors, which were still there, still riding thermals above the far ridge, with the absolute confidence of things that have never had to work for what held them up. She went back inside and answered the next pause. The first visual contact was scheduled for 8 days after the ship reached orbit. The 8 days were filled with protocol. Mara attended most of the meetings with the quality of attention she gave to rainfall, aware of it, present in it, not particularly engaged by it. The important things were happening in the signal exchanges, which were accelerating now, the shared vocabulary rich enough that real information could move. She was sleeping 4 hours a night and eating whatever appeared in front of her, and had not combed her hair in 3 days, a fact pointed out to her by Sithole, with the affectionate practicality of someone who had decided to look out for her and was not going to be argued with about it. You're the one they know, Sithole said, working a comb through the knot at the back of Mara's head with the practiced efficiency of someone who had raised younger siblings. You're going to be in the frame. You need to look like a representative of our species and not like a grad student during finals. I am a representative of our species, Marsa said. This is what our species looks like when it's been working for 3 weeks. On the first date, Sithole said, and got the knot out. The first visual contact would not be in person. The Vorath ship was in orbit. The Kestrel post was on the ground. And there was no mechanism yet for anything more direct. It would be a video transmission, encoded in the shared mathematical framework. 2 screens talking across a distance that human technology had just barely learned to shout across. The committee had argued about who should be in the frame for 2 full days before General Osi had said quietly that the Vorath had already decided who they wanted to talk to, and could the committee please catch up. So it was Mara. Mara and a translator interface and a camera and whatever she was going to say when she saw whatever was going to be there. She didn't prepare a statement. She tried. She sat in front of a blank page for 40 minutes. But every sentence she wrote felt like a performance, and performance was exactly what had gotten humanity's first contact attempts wrong. The mathematical prime broadcasts, beautiful and sterile, addressing the cosmos like a job application. All structure, no warmth, all content, no hesitation, no acknowledgement that communications was not the transmission of information, but the building of a space where understanding might, eventually, live. She closed the blank page and went and sat with Sithole and drank tea, and they talked about nothing, a dissertation, a chess game, a condor, the way. The morning light hit the mountains, and by the time the contact window opened, she had remembered how to be a person rather than a diplomat, which was all she'd ever had that was actually hers to offer. The visual came through in layers. The encoding system rendered it in bands, top to bottom, like a slow curtain rising, and Mara sat in front of the screen and watched it arrive and tried to breathe. The Vorath were. She would write later in her notes that she was not going to try to describe them here because any description would be inadequate and would likely be misleading, which was both true and a small act of self-preservation, because the moment the image resolved, she felt something shift in the architecture of every assumption she'd ever made about what a conscious being looked like. They were present. That was the thing. Whatever she'd expected, something cold or mechanical, or vast or frighteningly simple, the entity in the screen was present in the way a person is present. The quality of the attention, the particular stillness that is not absence but focus, the sense of a gaze that was doing something, going somewhere, thinking. There was a long silence. Then Mara did the only thing that made sense. She lifted one hand. She didn't wave, just raised it, palm forward, and held it there. The Vorath in the screen. The translated visual equivalent of the Vorath in the screen, rendered through a mathematical encoding that was definitely losing something in translation, but was doing its remarkable best, shifted slightly. And then, with a movement that involved appendages Mara was not going to try to describe, it did something that the encoding translated, inevitably, perfectly, beautifully, as lifting something forward, toward her, an echo, a mirror to the same gesture, given back. Mara laughed. She didn't plan to. It came out of her like a breath she'd been holding for 55 days or 4 years of not being taken seriously, 6 years of being alone. With a silence she'd chosen because it was quieter than the noise of people who thought her work was premature, 31 years of being the kind of person who understood things before she could explain them, and had spent a lifetime being patient about it. She laughed, and she could see, in the translated visual, the Vorath in the screen doing something that she could not name, and would not try to name, that she recognized the way you recognize a chord. Not by analysis but by resonance. Thing that happens when two separate structures vibrate at the same frequency. And you don't hear two sounds anymore. You hear one. They were laughing too. The debrief afterward was 2 hours long, and Mara remembered almost none of it. She answered questions. She agreed to things. She nodded. Her body handled all of it, while her mind stayed in the moment before the laugh, the raising of the hand, the echo, things she could not name. At the end of the debrief, General Osi stopped her in the corridor. "Dr. Voss," he said. She stopped. "What it's worth," he said. "I think you were right, about the music." She looked at him. "You could have sent the committee's statement," he said, "the diplomatic primer. 600 signal clusters, fully reviewed, formally structured. You didn't. You sent a hesitation rhythm at 2 in the morning, because your instincts told you that was what the moment needed." He paused. "That's what opened this. Anyone could have done it," she said. "No," he said, simply, "they couldn't." She didn't argue. She was too tired, and she thought he might be right, and the combination of those two things was unusual enough that she wanted to be still with it for a moment. "Get some sleep," he said, not unkindly. She did. 7 hours, which was the longest she'd slept in 2 months. And when she woke, the mountains were golden in the late afternoon light, and Sithole had left tea on the console, and the signal channel was quiet, holding its breath the way a room does after something enormous has happened and hasn't finished happening yet. The negotiations, as they came to be called, took 3 years. In that time, Mara became many things she had not expected to be: famous, in a low-key way that she found uncomfortable, and managed by not reading anything written about her. A lead member of the First Contact Advisory Board, which was a title that made her feel faintly ridiculous. The closest thing to a friend that could exist between a human and the particular Vorath she'd come to think of, cautiously and unscientifically, as a distinct individual. A person who had learned, slowly and imperfectly, To think in a language where the self was always relational, always defined by its adjacency, always only existing in the context of the other. This changed her, not catastrophically, not in the way she saw some of the other scientists changed, overwhelmed, temporarily unable to navigate a world that had expanded too suddenly. She was changed the way the mountains were changed by water. Slowly, definitively, you couldn't see happening, but could see the evidence of afterward. She stopped being afraid of the silence. She had not known she was afraid of it until she wasn't. She started finding it easier to say what she meant directly, without the layers of qualification she'd built up. Over years of being told her work was premature. If you could communicate across species, cross the void, in a language assembled from mathematical first principles and mutual patience, probably say what you meant to a room full of people. She called her dissertation supervisor. She had not spoken to him in 4 years. Mara, he said. I've been thinking about your margin note, she said, the why. Ah, he said, he sounded older. I owe you an apology for that. You don't, she said. But I wanted you to know that I can answer it now. She paused. Because the question is the thing that makes us us. It's not specific to humans. The Vorith do it too. In their way, they reach toward what they don't understand, rather than away from it. But we do, it with a particular stubbornness. We send signals into the dark for 14 years with no answer, and we keep sending them. We sit in shipping containers on mountain ridges waiting for something that has almost no probability of happening. And we wait and we listen. Ridiculous about it. We are embarrassingly, relentlessly, stubbornly curious. She paused again. That's why. That's the answer. Supervisor was quiet for a moment. Publish that, he said. That's the paper. I know, she said. The Vorith eventually asked, in their way, about aloneness. They had the concept Sithole had been wrong about that in the early days, but it was a concept that lived in a different register for them. Not non-existence. More like, the signal cluster took weeks to properly unpack, a state of perpetual incompletion. To be alone was to be a word without a sentence, not nothing. But not yet something. Mara thought about this for a long time before responding. She explained it carefully, that humans could be alone and still be something. That the self could exist in solitude. That there were even humans who found solitude restorative, productive, necessary. That the silence could be, if you were the right kind of person in the right kind of moment, full rather than empty. The Vorith response was slow in coming. 3 days, which was unusual. They were almost always faster. When it arrived, it was long and dense. And Mara and Sithole and the translation team spent a week on it. The core of it, stripped of the complexity of the relational grammar, was something like, this explains many things. We had wondered how you could keep reaching toward us when reaching is, for us, only possible toward what is already present. We thought you must have others with you. We did not understand how you could do it alone. Mara drafted her response without committee review because it was 4 in the morning and the committee was asleep, and she had learned by that point some things were better said quickly, she said. I had the signal, I had the question, I had the dark, and the mountains, and a condor, and a chess game. By correspondence with a man in Edinburgh, who is 93 years old and very good. Being patient. I was not alone in the way you mean. I was alone in the way I needed to be. There is a human kind of solitude that is not emptiness. It is the space you make around yourself, so you can hear the thing that is very quiet. The thing you would miss if you were not still enough to catch it. I heard you, she said. From very far away, I heard you being afraid to be too much. And that was enough. That is the thing about humans. We are very good at quiet. We are very good at waiting. We are very good at staying in the dark a little longer than is comfortable. Listening for the sound that almost wasn't there. You were almost not there, she said. But almost is not nothing. Almost is where everything starts. In the 4th year, the Vorith asked to land. Mara was asleep when the request came in. Sithole woke her. She came to the console in her socks and read the signal cluster and sat with it for a where, she said. They're asking us to choose, Sithole said. They don't want to pick somewhere that, the cluster is something like, somewhere that would feel like a claim. They want to go somewhere that already means something to us. Mara thought about the condor. Here, she said. Tell them here. The landing party was small, 6 Vorith, in a surface shuttle that descended in the early morning, out of a sky that had gone flat and gray with cloud so that there was no drama of stars, just the ordinary sky, and then a shape in it that was not supposed to be there, and then the shape resolving into something that touched down in the rocky flat below the ridge, with a delicacy that seemed, to the cluster of humans watching from the ridge, entirely out of proportion to the scale of what was happening. Mara walked down alone. She'd fought for this. The committee wanted an escort, a delegation, formal representation, she'd said. If you put 40 people on that ridge, it looks like a negotiating position. One person looks like what it is. Someone coming to meet someone. General Osi had said nothing for a moment, and then said, "Go." The shuttle hatch opened when she was 20 meters away. She stopped. She waited. The wind was moving across the flat, pushing her hair back from her face, and it was cold. The cold of altitude and early morning. A clean cold that didn't ask anything of you. The Vorath came out in the same careful way they did everything, slowly, pausing, looking. They were. She was not going to describe them. She had made this promise to herself and she kept it. The description was always going to be inadequate. Present. Intensely, quietly present. The way the mountains were present. The way the condor was present, which was to say, not performing, not declaring, just being there in the fullest sense of the word. They stopped about 10 meters from her. There was a long pause. Mara raised her hand, palm forward. The same gesture, the first one, the original one, the one she'd used because she didn't know what else to do. And it had turned out to be the right thing anyway. The lead Vorath did the same thing back. The forward-reaching movement. The echo. They stood there in the cold morning wind. On a ridge in the eastern Cordillera, two species looking at each other for the first time with their actual bodies, and not just their signals, and the silence was full. The way silence can be full. The way Mara had learned over years of listenings that silence is never empty if you're patient. Enough to hear what's in it. Then the Vorath did something. They were not laughing. Whatever they were doing was probably not analogous to laughter in any direct way. But it had the quality she'd heard before, in the transmitted visual, in the moment after she'd laughed. The vibration at the same frequency, the two things that stopped being two things. Something that was not solitude, and not presence but the space between them, which was where all conversation actually lived. Mara breathed in the cold air. She felt the wind on her face. She thought about 14 years of signals into the dark, and 4 years of waiting outside the system, and 47 days of careful music. And all the things that had happened in the hesitation between one pulse and the next. She thought about the dissertation supervisor who had written "why" in the margin. She thought, because we are the thing that asks. We have always been the thing that asks. We ask in the dark with no one listening, for years, and then one day something hears us, and we have no idea what it is, and we could run but we don't run. Because that is not the kind of thing we are. We are the kind of thing that raises our hand in the dark and waits to see if something raises its hand back. The Vorath were very still in front of her, very attentive. She could feel the quality of the attention like a sound, she said. Not in any language they shared, not yet, just in hers, because sometimes the sound of the voice matters more than the words, she said. "Hi. I've been looking forward to this." And then she laughed again, and again the thing that was not laughter happened on the other side, and the gap between them closed by one more measure, and the mountains watched. And the condors rode the thermals above the far ridge, with the absolute patience of things that have found what holds them up, and see no reason to move, and the cold, clear morning of the earth held all of it, all of it, all of it. In her notes, written years later, Dr. Mara Voss would describe the first contact this way. We sent signals for 14 years with no answer. We did this not because we were certain anyone would respond, but because we are a species constitutionally incapable of not trying. We tried in the dark, without evidence, with poor equipment and limited resources, and a great deal of institutional skepticism, because the question was more important than the probability of an answer. The Vorath waited for 4 years in the outer system, outside our notice, for making their hesitation audible. They were afraid, not of us precisely, but of overwhelming us. They had, in their history, encountered intelligences that could not receive them gently, and the encounter had not gone well. They had learned to approach as you approach a frightened animal. Slowly, with your hands visible, making no sudden movements. That we met each other at all is a function of two improbable forms of stubbornness. Ours, which is the stubbornness of reaching, and theirs, which is the stubbornness of waiting. The first word of the first conversation was not a word, it was a rhythm. A pause and a pulse, played back and forth in the dark, between one entity that had been listening in silence for 11 days and another that had been waiting in silence 4 years, both of them uncertain, both of them trying, both of them constitutionally unable to stop. I don't know what humanity's place in the larger story of this galaxy will turn out to be. I don't know if we are rare or common, significant or ordinary. I don't know what we have that matters in the vast scale of things. But I know this. On a cold morning on a ridge in the Andes, a species that had been alone for all of its known history raised its hand in the dark and waited, and something raised its hand back. That's us. That's the thing we are. Whatever else we turn out to be, whatever the next chapter holds, that moment is ours. We are the species that asked. We kept asking, and one day the dark answered.